The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, says he'll consider deregistering the CFMEU over charges of misconduct and illegal behaviour. Mr Morrison has criticised the union's Victorian secretary for using a photograph of his children carrying a placard with an expletive as part of a campaign against the industry watchdog. Joining us now is political reporter Henry Bello from Parliament House. Henry, does this represent a tougher stance from the Morrison government?
Well, it does. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, was asked about this during an interview with Alan Jones earlier today. And the question was, would you consider deregistering the CFMEU? To which he said, yes, absolutely. Now, this came in the context of him criticising the Victorian Branch Secretary, John Setka, who used his children to send a message with expletive language to the industry watchdog. Now, the Royal Commission into the trade union movement did look at this, but it did not recommend breaking up the CFMEU or deregistering it, and the Turnbull government certainly didn't pursue that path. So it does indicate something of a strengthening position by Scott Morrison. He said that he's not afraid of a fight in industrial relations, and that this message that was sent on Father's Day is really the last straw. He's also said that if there is legislation needed to crack down on unions further, then that's something he would consider. Let's have a look at what he said to Alan Jones earlier today.
Well, of course I would. And for a simple reason, I'll be discussing that with Kelly O'Dwyer, as you know, who's my new Minister for Industrial Relations. I'm not afraid to talk about industrial relations. The CFMEU has behaved under John Setka like a bunch of thugs, and to involve his children in that, I think, is one of the ugliest things I've seen.
Henry, what's been Labor's reaction to this?
Well, dismissive at this stage, and perhaps not unsurprisingly from the Labor movement. Scott Morrison has long been a critic of the unions, and particularly their links to the Labor Party, but he has not said this as Prime Minister. He has said some, anti-unions and been very critical of them while he's been the Treasurer and the Immigration Minister, but his words carry a lot more weight now he is the Prime Minister. The Labor frontbencher Anthony Albanese was talking about this today with reporters. He said that, as I mentioned, there has been a Royal Commission into the unions at considerable expense to the taxpayers, and it did not recommend this, deregistering the CFMEU, so therefore it was unnecessary. Here's how he described it.
Well, that's typical of Scott Morrison. They had a Royal Commission at a considerable cost to the taxpayers of Australia. That Royal Commission, of course, was all about trying to damage Labor and damage Bill Shorten in particular. It failed. The fact is that when you have a Royal Commission, then you've already had an independent look at these matters.
And Henry, Scott Morrison says he's open to a Royal Commission into the power industry.
Yeah, that's right. Another sign that the Morrison government is really trying to make reducing electricity prices its key pitch to voters before an election. He was asked today if he would consider this Royal Commission, and he said yes, as long as it could determine whether taxpayers and clients were being charged too much more than they needed to be. Now, it's interesting that this is being said at the moment because, of course, this is the time where the Morrison government wants to differentiate itself from the Turnbull government, particularly on energy policy, which has proved so tumultuous for the coalition government. And despite these strong signals that reducing electricity prices is going to be their core focus, there are some within the coalition, particularly Conservative MPs, who want to see the government withdraw from the Paris Climate Change Accords, which would set some emission reduction targets. The Prime Minister today says, though, that it is possible to reduce electricity prices and cut carbon emissions, something that many in the coalition don't believe and are pushing for. He spoke about this with Alan Jones earlier today. Let's have a look.
Electricity prices reduced ahead of emission reductions.
Well, they're two separate issues. They're completely separate issues.
You can't have one without the other.
You've got climate policies which have been running now for some time, and that's why we've met all of those targets in a canter. And so what I'm doing is separating those two issues out.
So there is still some clarity needed on the government's energy policy, a very tumultuous policy that's caused some headaches over the last few months, something that they need to really get strengthened before they go to the polls.
Thanks, Henry.